My name is Christopher Wilson. I'm Director of the Program in African American Culture here at the National Museum of American History, and I'd like to welcome you all for coming out tonight for what I'm sure will be a very stimulating and engaging conversation about a topic that is as relevant today as it was during the Lincoln administration. Tonight's program is part of a six-part series that we're presenting in conjunction with our exhibition, Abraham Lincoln, An Extraordinary Life, which is on the third floor of this building. And I invite you to all come back and see if you have not. The exhibition was opened last year for the bicentennial of Lincoln's birth and features artifacts in the Smithsonian's National Collection that relate to the 16th president. In our public programs series, we've been exploring issues that arose during or were confronted by the Lincoln administration and that still challenge our country to this day. We've explored issues such as science and the presidency and the relationship between Lincoln and prominent African Americans like Frederick Douglass, and comparing that with the relationship between more modern presidents and such as Lyndon Johnson and Martin Luther King, for instance. And we will be looking at issues on future programs like the expansion of presidential power during wartime. I'd like to take this opportunity to tell you about our next program, which was supposed to be our third in the series, but we had the snowstorm. So it has been rescheduled for this coming Tuesday, and the program is The Brass Letters of Citizenship, Lincoln, African Americans, and Military Service. In that program, we'll have our moderator will be NPR Pentagon correspondent Tom Bowman, and our panel will include Dr. Ira Berlin speaking about African Americans in the military during the Civil War, and also we'll invite Dr. Nathaniel Frank, who's Senior Research Fellow at the Palm Center at UC Santa Barbara, and author of Unfriendly Fire, which looks at the Don't Ask, Don't Tell policy. So we'll be comparing those issues of the 19th century and today. So I invite you to come back and see us on Tuesday or tell your friends about it. I'd like to next thank our sponsors for this series and this evening's program, the Gilder Lehrman Institute of American History, which through their exhibition, Lincoln, A Man of His Time, A Man for All Time, is sponsoring this series along with the National Endowment for the Humanities. Everything we do here at the museum is done by a team. I'd like to reference just a few of the people that have worked on the Lincoln lecture series. Our curator, Harry Rubenstein, head of the Lincoln Project, James Zimmerman, Aaron Nielsen, Elizabeth Kilday, Johanna Mutz, and our interns who are here tonight, Kyle Bridges, Kim Miller, Alyssa Frankel, and Lindsay Hagan. Museum is most centrally about objects, and we use the vast national collection here at the Smithsonian to stimulate imaginations and raise challenging questions about our nation's past in order to help us understand and explore what it is meant to be an American. Therefore, our programs and exhibitions always begin with objects or documents in our collection, and tonight's program is no different. I would like to begin tonight by looking at a simple wooden desk on display in the Lincoln show on the third floor here. This desk dates from Lincoln's time, and many of Lincoln's cases were in Central Illinois' 14th Circuit, also known as the Mud Circuit for its poor roads. Stopping at county seats, the circuit judge and a traveling band of lawyers would quickly handle pending cases and disputes and move on to the next town. Lincoln loved the circuit, the camaraderie, and the courtroom sparring. This wooden desk is from the courthouse in Pekin, Illinois. Lincoln and his fellow circuit lawyers shared the workspace as they prepared their cases. Most of the desk is not original, only the top rail survives from Lincoln's time, but Senator Everett Dirksen of Illinois purchased this desk for $10 as Republican minority leader during the Johnson administration. Dirksen played a crucial role in helping to write and pass much of the civil rights legislation of the 1960s. It is likely that he did some of this work at the same desk once used by Abraham Lincoln. After the senator's death, Mrs. Dirksen donated the desk to the Smithsonian in 1970. It was his pride and joy, she wrote. When he was at home in Pekin instead of Washington, he would take his work upstairs to his Lincoln desk every evening after supper, rather than working in his downstairs study. The issues that were confronted at this desk obviously spanned many men's lives, and we thought that this was a good object to look at because so many of these issues that arose during Lincoln's time, again, still challenge and vex this nation. Lastly, before I introduce our moderator for tonight, I would also like to welcome all of our viewers watching on our live webcast that is going on tonight as well. So please enjoy the program and join me in welcoming Fath Davis Ruffins, our moderator, who is the curator of African American history and culture here at the museum. Thank you.
Thank you so much for braving the traffic and the snow to come out tonight to this very interesting panel that we're going to have with such distinguished guests. Let me introduce to you the four speakers. I'm going to introduce them all at once, and then they're going to come up to the podium, to the stage. First, I'm introducing them in alphabetical order. First, we have Dr. Maurice Jackson, who is an associate professor of history and African American studies and affiliated faculty at the Department of Performing Arts and Music at Georgetown University. He came to the academy later than most, having spent a good part of his early adulthood as a community and progressive organizer. He has also been, I thought this was fascinating, a longshoreman and a rigger in his hometown of Newport News, Virginia, and a house painter and construction worker in Washington, D.C. He is the author of many publications, far too numerous to mention here. His Let This Voice Be Heard, Anthony Benezet, Father of Atlantic Abolitionism, was published by the University of Pennsylvania Press in January 2009. He is co-editor with Jackie Bacon of African Americans and the Haitian Revolution, Selected Essays and Historical Documents, which was published by Routledge Press just in January 2010. James and Esther Jackson, A Personal Introspective, is an article that appears in African American Communists and the Origins of the Modern Civil Rights Movement, which was just published in the fall of 2009. A former Kluge Fellow of the Library of Congress, he is currently at work on a social and political and cultural history of African Americans in Washington, D.C. from 1790 to the present. Next, we have Dr. Chandra Manning, who is an associate professor of history at Georgetown University, a graduate of Mount Holyoke, University College Galway, Ireland, and Harvard University. She has also taught at Pacific Lutheran University in Tacoma, Washington, and very interestingly for our business, worked as a park ranger at the National Park Service, and in recent years has been very active in public outreach efforts with several state historical societies. Her first book, What This Cruel War Was Over, Soldiers, Slavery, and the Civil War, won the Avery O. Craven Award, earned honorable mention for the Lincoln Prize, the Jefferson Davis Prize, and Virginia Literature Award in Nonfiction, which has to be unusual to have won honorable mention on both the Lincoln Prize and the Jefferson Davis Prize, and was a finalist for the Frederick Douglass Prize. So those are three names we all recognize from this era. She is working on a book about contraband camps and how the interactions of formerly enslaved people with the federal government during and after the Civil War compelled Americans to reconsider what the notions of freedom and citizenship really meant. Next, we have Dr. Edna Medford, who is a professor in the Department of History at Howard University. She has also served as director of the department's graduate and undergraduate programs and as director of the history component of the New York African Burial Ground Project. Dr. Medford sits on the advisory boards of several professional organizations, including Washington History Magazine, the Knox College Lincoln Studies Center, Ulysses S. Grant Papers, and President Lincoln's Cottage, which is in Washington in the Old Soldiers' Home complex. In the last few years, she has been very involved with the Advisory Council of the Abraham Lincoln Bicentennial Commission as it supports programs in commemoration of the 200th anniversary of the birth of Abraham Lincoln. She is a member of the Executive Committee of the Lincoln Forum, a national organization dedicated to the study of President Lincoln and the Civil War era. Her publications include the co-authored The Emancipation Proclamation, Three Views, and Historical Perspectives on the African Burial Ground Project, New York Blacks and the Diaspora, which she edited. She is a 2009 recipient of the Order of Lincoln for her study of the President and the Civil War era. And lastly, but not at all leastly, we have Dr. Ronald Walters, who is now Professor Emeritus at the University of Maryland, College Park. He is a political analyst, author, and syndicated columnist. Internationally known for his expertise in African and African American politics, he received his BA from Fisk University and both an MA and PhD from American University. He formerly served as professor and department chair at Howard and Brandeis Universities. And he was an assistant professor at Syracuse University and a visiting professor at Princeton University, and a fellow of the Institute of Politics at the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard. He also served as senior staff to Congressional Caucus member Charles Diggs of Detroit and William Gray of Philadelphia. Among his 10 books, Black Presidential Politics in America, which was published in 1989, won the Ralph Bunche Prize, given by the American Political Science Association, and the Best Book Award from the National Conference of Black Political Scientists. He has won many other awards and has substantial practical experience as the deputy campaign manager for the Reverend Jesse Jackson's 1984 presidential campaign and senior advisor in the 88 campaign. If you could welcome all four of our distinguished guests to the stage. You would come up now. Okay, good. The way we've organized this panel is that each person is going to give about a 5 or 7 minute. Oh, that's right. We have to hook you back up now. Oh, now I didn't quite mean it to be so gendered.
You can switch. You can certainly switch.
That's great. Okay, that's lovely. Each of our panelists is going to give about a 5-minute introduction of remarks. They were sent a series of questions, which they may respond to, or they may have other questions that they think are more important than the ones we sent. So they'll each give an intro, and then we'll have some conversation among the panel, and then in about 40 minutes at the most, we will go to questions and answers from the floor. So, who would like to begin?
I'd like to end.
You'd like to end, Dr.
I
Walters.
can certainly start. That would
Thank
be fine
you, Dr.
with me.
Medford.
Okay. And I guess we can do it from the seated
Yes,
position.
if you like.
Okay.
If you'd like to stand up, you can, but you don't have to.
Okay. Last year's bicentennial observance of Lincoln's birth was, as expected, a reaffirmation of our national commitment to preserve the image of the president as an iconic figure. Yet there was also a fair amount of sober reflection on the life and thought of this very complex man. The issue of race, a topic of little, if any, attention in previous Lincoln celebrations, became a rather significant feature of this most recent commemoration. Discussions of race are likely to continue to capture our attention as we prepare for and observe the sesquicentennial of the Civil War. But to what end? For as much as we profess to be open to discussions about race, Americans are, in general, still in denial of the severity of the problem. I am reminded that in recent years, especially in the last, there has been an effort underway to ensure Americans, especially African Americans, that race no longer exists as a problem of national concern. But the argument that younger generations have become colorblind makes me that much more skeptical that we have evolved into post-racial beings. Should it even be our goal to structure a society that ignores race, or do we want one that acknowledges instead our differences and celebrates them? It takes little effort to see that race still shapes our thinking about each other and prevents the nation from moving forward to tackle increasingly serious problems. Its negative influences are especially evident in our responses to national crises. As we begin our celebration of the sesquicentennial, we face growing resentment and fear from a segment of the American population that feels marginalized because the nation chose to move in a different direction in 2008. Such was the situation that led to the Civil War. The secessionists had feared an assault on their way of life, an existence based on white supremacy and the exploitation of an entire race of people. Those who are similarly aggrieved today would do well to remember that the secessionists hastened the very thing that they most feared, the end of slavery. While Lincoln hated the institution, he had formulated no plan at the beginning of his presidency to issue an emancipating document. But the secessionist extreme response to his election led to their own undoing. Like Lincoln, the resentment and distrust of government that seem to be gaining momentum throughout the country today is directed toward the man who symbolizes the recent shift in national direction. Although the Obama election was touted as the beginning of post-racialism, we see less and less evidence of that as the nation is exposed to the ranting of the birthers and the thinly veiled language of the ultra-right. Socialist and Muslim, perfectly honorable terms in earlier times, have taken the place of the N-word, and in their contextual use are meant to be just as deprecating. Today's racially motivated critics have found ever more clever ways to identify their objections to the noticeable change in command. In the past, black men and women were denied respect because of educational deficiencies and, quote, servile background. Now the criticism, ironically, centers on too great a facility with language, Ivy League ways, and an overabundance of confidence. From the perspective of these new critics, the president is too professorial, too aloof, too uppity, the latter word being code for a Negro who thinks he deserves to be treated as a man. While we have legitimate grounds for disagreement in this country, the pettiness that pervades politics, much of it based on racial characteristics, ethnically identified names, and erroneously perceived religious affiliations, is destructive of what we say are our American values. We perseverate on threats of international terrorism, and understandably so, but we barely lift a voice in protest against those who pray for the failure of a democratically elected government. In similar fashion, much of the outcry against the handling of the would-be Christmas Day bomber suggests a double standard that one could reasonably construe to be racially motivated. Historically, acts of terrorism, if committed on American soil, come under the purview of the Justice Department as lead agency. So when the previous administration sought to bring the shoe bomber to justice through this means, their actions elicited no public outcry. But as the Obama administration attempts to follow the same procedure, the response has been unnecessarily caustic. In this kind of environment, it is likely that the upcoming commemoration of the Civil War will see a return to states' rights arguments as to the reason for the conflict, as if defense of slavery and notions of racial superiority had nothing to do with the deaths of over 200,000 men between 1861 and 1865. In fact, a proponent of the Tea Party movement declared recently that the states have the right to secede from the rest of the nation at any time. It is the argument that we thought the Civil War had answered once and for all. Well, apparently not. Given the intense partisan criticism of the current administration, we are likely to see rather cautious support from the executive branch for discussion of race as a part of the sesquicentennial commemoration. President Obama has to prove continuously and convincingly that he is the leader of all the people. He cannot afford to be perceived as championing the interest of one group of Americans over another, or of focusing too much attention on what many are likely to view as a minority issue. Like Lincoln, any personal views he might hold must be subordinate to his public obligations. And although discussions of race will go forward, the impetus will spring from those who are not as constrained by politics and position.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Professor Jackson.
Well, I'll give it a try. Thank you. Several points come to mind. As we think of Lincoln, we historians are often told that we must deal with the person within his period. You cannot take people outside of context. And so, but sometimes we almost have to. And I'll give some examples. By the time Lincoln becomes president, many of us are taught to think that it's the first time race or issues of race have been discussed. I deal with the 18th century mostly. In the 18th century, quite frankly, the discussions were even more advanced. And I'll give you some examples. One example is of Benjamin Franklin, who said two statements. Almost every slave is by nature a thief. And over the years, as he came to know blacks and had operating work with people, he changed the statement. Almost every slave is made by the nature of slavery a thief. Now, those, of course, two great differences. And a lot of it had to do with his actual contact with blacks. He also had contact with another man, Benjamin Rush, who became the founder of modern American medicine. And Benjamin Rush had come to anti-slavery, but he had no love for blacks. But over a period of time, he developed. And as he developed, he had this beautiful statement: I love all of Africa. I love everything about Africa. And the reason he wrote that was because he had started studying Africa, but because he had come in contact with two great men, Richard Allen and Absalom Jones, the founder of the American, founder of modern black religion. And as he got to know them, mainly through the yellow fever epidemic in Philadelphia. Now, Allen and Jones had proved, number one, that they were equal to anyone else, but they'd also disproved the white myth. And the myth was that blacks could not get yellow fever because they were there to help the whites save themselves from yellow fever. And so as Rush worked with those, he developed these ideas. And he and Franklin and the man who I wrote this book on, Anthony Benezet, became leaders. And one thing they did more than others was that they fought diligently to prove that blacks were men. And that becomes key. Because many could accept the blacks as slaves. They could even accept them as religious converts, but they could not accept of them as human beings. And some of us know the statement of Du Bois, as he spoke about U.B. Phillips. They could not accept us as men. That is the big. And so we had these debates. And in the 1840s, a wonderful statement, James Fordham Jr.'s son said, where are the Benezets, the Caspars, the Franklins, the Rushes, because he felt that white America was lacking. Now, the 1840s, when the Black Convention movements. Now, when Lincoln comes onto the front 10 so years later, and I spent a good time just reading some of his statements and things, it becomes a real mixed bag. He moves back and forth, and you sometimes wonder why. In 1857, he said this: the Negro is a man. The Democrats deny his manhood, deny or dwarf to insignificance the wrong of his bondage, excite hatred and disgust against him, compliments themselves as Union savers for doing so. In 1957, but he did say the Negro is a man. By the year 1858, he says, all equivalent about this man and the other, this race and the other race, being inferior, and therefore they must be placed in other inferior positions. Who shall say, I am superior and you are the inferior? So at that point, he's developing, at points it seems like an understanding. Then comes the Lincoln-Douglas debates. And he says there, the Negro is not my equal in many respects, certainly not in color, perhaps not in moral or intellectual endowments. He said that the physical difference between the races, which in my judgment will probably forbid their living together upon equal footing. So he sort of steps back. But then he steps forward again. And this comes around the time of the D.C. emancipation. Because as we know, D.C. the D.C. slaves were emancipated in 1862, April, about 11 months before the nation as a whole. And of course, that is the big debate, as you all will know better than I, who emancipated, who were the slaves emancipated by Lincoln, and all those things. But anyway, he said in a letter to Horace Greeley, and it's a wonderful letter, March 24, 1862, I'm a little uneasy about the abolishment of slavery in the district, but I will be glad to see it abolished, but it's time and manner of doing. And he goes on about why he has certain reticent attitudes about it, but he sees that he must. And he does that in April 15th, and of course we know about D.C. Emancipation Day here. But he says, and so you again see his development ideas by July of 1862. He says, we must free the slaves or be ourselves subdued. Now, so by then he sees slavery as an institution that will also bring down and can bring down the nation, or the white race, so to speak, but the nation as we know. And he goes on and on, developing his ideas, of course, with D.C. emancipation, the ideas of emancipated compensation, shall you pay for the slaves? Will you pay the slaves for his labor? No. Will you pay the owner? Of course, yes. And then he develops some other ideas. Now, in August of 62, he comes to some interesting conclusions. I mean, in August of 62, he meets with black leaders at the White House. He invites them to the White House. And he tells them, not a single man of your race is made equal to a single man of ours. Now, does he mean that that's what he's believed? He's just saying the society is made, but that is what he's saying. So then he says to them, go where you are to be treated best. In essence, he's coming for the colonization. Now, as I mentioned before, in the late 18th century, when Richard Allen and Absalom Jones and others had met with Benjamin Franklin and Rush, Franklin and Rush all opposed colonization because they believed that was a way of just ridding the nation of free blacks, but also they believed that the blacks themselves were deserving. They had worked here. But Lincoln steps back a little bit. And then he says some unique things. Your race is suffering, the greatest wrong inflicted upon any people. But even when you cease to be slaves, you are far removed from being placed on equality with the white race. Is he saying this to tell them what is real, or is he saying them what he believes? Well, the language is murky in this sense. And he tells them that he, nevertheless, repeats, without the institution of slavery and the color race as the basis, the war could not have had an existence. So he brings to an end anyone's thinking that the war is fought for anything other than slavery, as some people throw out now without any basis. So he comes, and so he's still developing his ideas of race in this sense. So therefore, you can discuss issues of slavery and fight for the abolition of slavery, but still not see the races equal. And because this becomes an interesting point. And then I would end with just one other thing that he said, and well, you would tell me who it sounds like. It is exceedingly important that we have men at the beginning capable of thinking as white men, and not those who have been systematically oppressed. Let me read it one more time. It is exceedingly important that we have men at the beginning capable of thinking as white men, and not those who have been systematically oppressed. Of course, if you change the name Lincoln to Harry Reid, you may have pretty much the same thing. So again, Lincoln is this complicated figure that I want to just put here. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Manning.
We didn't plan this, but actually, going after you makes some sense because although I hate following Maurice Jackson, I think it's like trying to follow Elvis or something like that. What I have to say,
How about Charlie Parker?
That's better. You're right. I actually wanted to spend some time thinking with you tonight about what does change in Lincoln's thinking during the war and why. I really did try and pay attention to the questions about comparisons with Lincoln and today, but I have a real failure of imagination. I have a very hard time comparing the present and the past. It's not even apples and oranges for me. It's like apples and pot roast. So instead, I really want to think about what does change and why. And the why is pretty sobering. And so that's what I'd like to talk about tonight. That Lincoln hated slavery is undeniable. As he put it, if slavery is not wrong, then nothing is wrong. But Lincoln's attitudes towards race, as Maurice has suggested, were far more complicated. His early support for ending slavery was accompanied by his preference for the colonization of black people outside of the United States. Now, that preference is based on a number of things, not just his dislike or distrust of people that looked differently from him, but also a presumption that blacks and whites could not coexist harmoniously because Lincoln feared white people would never overcome their own prejudices. A universal feeling, which he believed white prejudice to be, whether well or ill-founded, cannot be safely disregarded, he cautioned in 1858. And he made that same point again when the delegation of black men visited him in the White House in August of 1862, when he admitted, and with no pride, that there is an unwillingness on the part of our people, harsh as it may be, for you free-colored people to remain with us. So I'm trying to say that the roots, the origins of Lincoln's discomfort with the idea of a biracial society are themselves pretty complicated. But whatever the roots, whatever the sources, the result was that for most of his life, Lincoln saw whites and blacks as separate and unequal and bound to stay that way. But by the midpoint of the Civil War, the cautious, legalistic Abraham Lincoln had not only used the power of the United States government to abolish slavery, which is itself a pretty big deal, he had also rejected notions of colonization. He had invited public ridicule by inviting Frederick Douglass to the White House and calling him friend, and by the end of his life referred to African Americans as citizens, which is a far more radical thing to do than it's easy for us to quite understand. Now, did he become Martin Luther King Jr.? No, he didn't even become the most enlightened racial thinker of his own day. But something changed. And the important question to me seems to be how and why did this change happen? And to answer those questions for just a minute, I'd like us to step back from the issue of race and put it into context with some of Lincoln's other thinking. Now, if Lincoln's ideas about race were complex, which they were, on the topic of the government of the United States, they were crystal clear. He genuinely loved the principles stated in the Declaration of Independence with a reverence that really bordered on religious devotion. And he regarded the Constitution and the Union as necessary safeguards for those very principles. But why did the Union matter so much to Lincoln? Well, in his view, I think the survival of the Union was not just a matter of power, it wasn't just a matter of territorial sovereignty, and it mattered for more than just Americans. As he saw it, the survival of the Union mattered for all humanity. In his first message to Congress, Lincoln affirmed that this war embraces more than the fate of these United States. It presents to the whole family of man the question whether a constitutional republic or a democracy, a government of the people, by the same people, can or cannot succeed. If the Union was destroyed, as he saw it, human beings everywhere would be forced to draw the grim conclusion that self-government could not work and that the ideals articulated in the Declaration of Independence were hollow and meaningless. Now, right from the very beginning of the war, some Americans recognized that if the Union is supposed to stand for universal principles, then its survival couldn't be separated from questions of slavery and of race. Most such Americans were black. Just weeks after the fall of Fort Sumter, a black newspaper in New York admonished that no adjustment of this nation's difficulty is possible until the claims of the black man are first met and satisfied. If you would restore the Union that you so fondly cherish and maintain the government, make way for liberty, universal and complete. By the time those words made it into print, enslaved black Southerners had already begun making their way into Union Army camps. They knew full well that the fact of their bondage had brought two halves of the nation to blows, and they further knew that their fate and that of the Union were intertwined. The actions of those slaves and the mounting ferocity of the war convinced Abraham Lincoln of that same thing. Slaves kept running to Union Army camps, they kept making themselves indispensable, and they kept the question of slavery squarely in the face of officers who kept writing back to Washington, D.C. to ask for guidance what to do. Lincoln himself regularly passed by a refugee camp inhabited by slaves who had run to Union lines. Simply put, former slaves gave Abraham Lincoln little choice but to take them seriously, not just as an abstract question or problem, but as human beings. Now here comes the sobering part. That process was not a smooth one, and it was not a pleasant one. It consisted chiefly of trauma, sorrow, and loss. By the war's midpoint, loss was simply everywhere for Lincoln. His beloved son, Willie, died in 1862, and day after day, telegraphs transmitted unrelenting lists of the deaths of other people's sons. Lincoln's summer cottage at the Soldiers' Home in Washington, D.C. overlooked a soldier cemetery. Every single day, President Lincoln confronted 8,000 fresh graves. In the face of all that terrible loss, Abraham Lincoln looked inward, and he confronted failings in his nation and in himself. Why? As a desperate attempt to find a reason for all of the suffering. The hard truth, Lincoln came to believe, was that a just God would not allow a union to be saved until the sin of slavery was extirpated. And that sin was one in which a whole nation, including himself, was complicit, by virtue of that same prejudice that he admitted that he shared and that he had once thought was immovable. And so Lincoln began to change. 1 year after coldly dismissing that delegation of black men who visited at the White House, Lincoln invited Frederick Douglass to the first of what would be 3 meetings at the White House, and he genuinely listened to Douglass's views on improving the lot of African Americans. In his second inaugural address, Lincoln plainly linked the Union's survival to atonement for sins of slavery and prejudice. He made sense of the war by viewing every drop of blood, Union, for which he was responsible, as well as Confederate, drawn with a sword, as national and personal penance for every drop of blood drawn with the lash. And in his last public speech, delivered just days before a man who heard that speech would shoot him, Abraham Lincoln, who had once taken inequality and separation of the races for granted, called for the privilege that he associated above all others with equal citizenship, and that was the vote for African American soldiers. Now, we're so used to the second inaugural, and indeed to the concept of equal suffrage, that it's easy to lose sight of how radical Abraham Lincoln's last weeks were compared to himself just 4 years before. And so perhaps we're best served, certainly not by turning Lincoln to some kind of a saint, but neither by making ourselves feel good by telling ourselves how much more enlightened we are compared to Lincoln. Maybe rather we're best served by reflecting on the magnitude of change that proved possible in the crucible of war, and more soberly, on the unimaginable enormity of suffering and loss that it took for that change to happen. And I think the question we're presented with is that suffering and loss necessary, or are there other ways forward? Thank you.
Well,
Dr. Walters.
Thank you. I have to begin with a disclaimer, and that was that I did not call Edna Medford and to work out my piece with her.
That's why I went first.
You'll see some similarities. I want to talk about more, because I feel more at home in the present, a little bit more about the comparison between Lincoln and Abraham Lincoln, and to do so looking at the context within which they both came into office and the way in which they both tried to manage it. And I won't be that long. There are many ways that one can approach the legacy of Abraham Lincoln and its relevance to modern political events. One could focus on 3 aspects: personality, policy, and performance of a leader, as suggested by Dean Simonton. However, as a leadership scholar, I would like to focus briefly on the transformational aspect of performance, as promised by the mantra of change that was implicit in Lincoln's presidency and that was also explicitly proposed by Barack Obama. Lincoln came into office with a series of crises, the most serious of which found 7 of the original 34 states of the Union actually having succeeded as he was taking office. The impending Civil War then was the profoundest measure of national division based on the issue of the sovereignty of southern states, which included their rights to the bodies of black men and women. The rejection of this right meant that the core of southern thinking about the North became fixed on resentment. This resentment by the South that the North had prevented it from conducting slavery in the terms of the original deal that fostered our Constitution became a defensive morality that has matured as an ideology and defined the roots of a cultural divide since that time. Indeed, the most stable aspects of it, that the states of the old Confederacy, whether Democrat, as they were for most of the 19th century, or Republican, or for the last half of the 20th century, has been the dividing line of American politics, and it has been the keeper of the flame of that defensive resentment morality until this very day. The task for Lincoln then was to attempt to persuade the Confederate States, even through their resentment, that they were part of one nation that should have one standard with respect to opposing slavery. He observed in his Cooper Union speech that the South regarded Republicans as, quoting, reptiles, outlaws, black Republicans who were responsible for John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry, fostering insurrection, blood and thunder among the slaves, unquote. He accused them of attempting to destroy the government unless you be allowed to construe and enforce the Constitution as you please on all points in dispute between you and us. You will rule or ruin in all events. That sounds amazingly similar to something happening today. Nevertheless, also speaking to his fellow Republicans, he counseled them in the same speech, let us determine if we can what will satisfy them, not leave them alone, even if they had to pull down all of the symbols of opposition to slavery, to disinfect the taint of all opposition to slavery, until they are exposed to the lie that all their trouble proceeds from us. Also familiar. This objective, that both sides had a responsibility in the matter, flowed from his 1857 Illinois address, in which he said that the country could not remain half slave and half free, enunciating a logical consequence that a house divided against itself cannot stand, thereby invoking the necessity to achieve some way out of this through a united existence. To this extent, the mandate of unity was a considerable influence on Lincoln. It was said that he was not prone to retribution to the South for secession, but simply wanted them to leave the field of battle, resume their livelihood without stain of slavery upon them or the nation, to return to their farms and shops, and even, quoting, let them have their horses to plow and the guns to shoot the crows with, unquote. The way in which his own life was cut short, however, was testimony to the fact that this indeed would not occur. Coming into office, President Barack Obama also confronted a deep cultural divide created by the emergence of the conservative movement with the election of Ronald Reagan in 1980. The power of this movement was felt in 1988 by Michael Dukakis, the Democratic nominee for president, who ran against George Bush, that's H.W. Bush, presenting his campaign as one of competence, not ideology. And as such, he was roundly defeated. 4 years later, a Democrat, Bill Clinton, won with the help of an independent candidacy, Ross Perot. But by 1996, his second-term campaign boldly adopted the conservative view that, and I'm quoting, the era of big government is over, unquote. Thus, for the past 30 years, this movement has created an equal division, but defeated liberalism to the point that it has reached its most anemic political stance in over half a century. That is, liberalism has. Some data on this is striking. In 1964, people who trusted government was at a plus 54%. By 1978, it was at a minus 38%, and by 1980, a minus 48%. Obama's problem in governing was that the deep cultural divisions in society are reflected in Congress, in the political system, and prevent the unifying approach to the construction of ameliorative public policies. Indeed, shortly after his election, when asked whether the team of rivals, which Doris Kearns' book describes, could be adopted by Obama, Lincoln scholar Ronald White replied that it was much more difficult in the present environment for Obama to achieve a unity government because of the deeply divided political culture. Yet Barack Obama was inspired by much of Lincoln's concepts of unifying the nation in the midst of the crisis that he faced, and adopted Lincoln's Gettysburg Address, A New Birth of Freedom, for his inauguration theme. And from his 2004 speech at the Democratic National Convention all the way to his February 2009 remarks at the Lincoln Bicentennial, a celebration at the Capitol Rotunda and at Ford's Theater in Washington, he alluded to Lincoln as expressing, quoting, an unyielding belief that we were at heart one nation and one people, unquote. He believed that if we remembered that we are servants of the same flag and are stakeholders of a common future, that is the most fitting tribute that we could pay to Abraham Lincoln, unquote. While describing himself as not an ideologue, but as a pragmatic, however, Obama has been prone to respond to the drift of public opinion and to make tactical political decisions that could address the need for unity. This is the basis for his unending search for bipartisanship, I believe. But Fauner, and also an outstanding Lincoln scholar, suggested that Obama should confront the existing challenges of his own age by seizing, and I'm quoting, the opportunity that he comes in with to really take dramatic action. People want that. People want bold action, unquote. Now, the thing that interested me was that in making this statement, Fauner didn't cite Lincoln. He said that his model in this case was Franklin Delano Roosevelt. He reminds us in another place, that is Fauner, that Lincoln is important to us not because of how he chose his cabinet, but because of his role in the human drama of emancipation and the enduring legacy of slavery. In other words, his performance as president. One has to ask now where Barack Obama is situated in this crisis, in the deep division in our society, and whether, if the current style fails, that is to say, his negotiated style, his tendency toward unity, etc., will he move on to the stronger role that actually Lincoln had to move on to. As suggested, a major point of similarity, in conclusion, between Lincoln and Obama is that they both faced powerful dynamics flowing from deep social divisions emanating from within the political culture, the reflections of which had to be managed in the political system by presidential leadership. Lincoln obviously had to deal with those who were for and against the Union, but the war focused his direction and his methodology on winning, and therefore on strongly privileging the Union position as the standard to oppose slavery. Facing the deep social instabilities that are reflected in the stalemate in the current political system, Obama has attempted to address this somewhat by neutralizing the hard edges of conservative politics, by retaining the faith-based program in the White House, by adopting a governing position of bipartisanship, by supporting such issues as tax breaks for businesses, strong leadership in the war on terror, and other Republican-sounding elements. Ultimately, the need for Fauner's bold action to move the society toward unity or to achieve specific policy goals must come down on one side of the political ledger or the other, given the current stalemate. James McGregor Burns' concept of transformational leadership is contained in the moral achievement of Abraham Lincoln in changing the context of slavery. We do not know what act will be the hallmark of President Obama's legacy, and therefore whether the comparison is even apt. But we do note that the irony of the context in which both Lincoln and Obama governed is that to a great extent, the force of the old Confederacy and its conservative dogma stood in the way, and therefore the judgment of modern history may not be how Obama will remove this impediment. He cannot. But when the American people will eventually tire of its hold on their possibilities of achieving a new birth of freedom in the 21st century. Thank you.
Well, how wonderful. Everyone on the panel was very, very precise in terms of your timing. Are there any comments that you would like to make before we open it to questions on what others have said? I want to suggest to the audience that we, in particular, put this panel together to bring some people whose academic focus was on Lincoln and his era and on abolition and earlier times, and bring along with that some people whose focus is more on the present and contemporary politics. So it's by design that we have this range of scholarship. Are there any comments or questions from the audience? If you would like to comment or question, please come up to these microphones because it's being taped and broadcast, and so otherwise we won't be able to hear you. The audience everywhere won't be able to hear you. Yes, sir.
I have a couple of questions. One is that I recently read a book by James Stauffer, Giants, the Parallel Lives of Frederick Douglass and Abraham Lincoln. It's an interesting book, and basically he indicated that the evolution of Lincoln's perception of race was also dictated by his relationship with Frederick Douglass. And I guess I was a little confused because he only, and I'd like to get clarification on this. Douglass was invited to the White House on 3 occasions. And I don't know if those individuals met prior to Lincoln becoming president. And so I was a little confused as to how Stauffer could say that Lincoln's evolution of race was predicated on his relationship with Frederick Douglass, even though he had not really, he had only met him 3 times. Maybe I misunderstood the book, but I'd like to get your views on that. The other question that I have is that I'm 60 years old, and I've been following the Civil War since I was 8, primarily because I had a relative, distant relative, who fought in the war, and a neighbor of mine was a descendant of PBS Pinchback. And I guess and as we approach the 150th centennial of the anniversary of the Civil War, sometimes I visit internet sites and just get people's views on the Civil War. And I'm constantly amazed how people, particularly Southern white males, continue to maintain fossilized views of the Civil War and seem to be stuck in an historical paradigm that the North did not win the war, that they still feel that the war was not predicated on the abolition of slavery, that somehow it was predicated on the continuation of differences over states' rights, which seems to me was an inherent contradiction. And I just simply don't understand how is it that 150 years later, people still have these negative perceptions of Lincoln and still advocate the Southern way of life or the antebellum way of life. So I wanted to get your views on those two comments.
On those two comments, okay. Who would like to go first?
I'll start, if I may.
Yes.
Okay. The whole question of what accounts for Lincoln's evolution in terms of his racial views. Douglass does play a role, but so do other elite blacks. At the same time that Douglass is meeting Lincoln, and he doesn't meet him before the war, before he becomes president. He does meet him 3 times in the White House. Lincoln, of course, knows about Douglass. Everybody knows about Douglass. I mean, he makes that possible for the world, I guess. But Lincoln also understands, for instance, that in Louisiana, there are these elite blacks, many of them mulattoes, who are petitioning him for their rights. And that's one of the reasons why he is writing letters to Governor Hahn of Louisiana, suggesting that when the new Constitution is drafted, perhaps he can, the Louisiana legislature can see its way toward allowing some of these men to have citizenship rights. That's where he gets the whole idea of the very intelligent and those who have served as soldiers. I think before the war, Lincoln has very limited interaction with black people. Yes, he does have clients who are black. He has a cordial relationship, I don't know that I would call it friendship, but a cordial relationship with William Fleurville, Billy the Barber, as they call him. He has interaction with black servants, but what he knows about black people primarily is about slavery. But in Douglass and in the men in Louisiana who are certainly elites, who are certainly better educated than Lincoln even, and, well, at least the men in Louisiana. Douglass wasn't. Douglass was certainly self-taught, just like Lincoln for the most part. But in his interaction with other blacks, black people other than enslaved blacks, he begins to understand that there is a capacity for citizenship. And so he's willing to go that route. But I think I differ with Stauffer to a certain extent. I think that in large measure, Lincoln changes his attitude because of black soldiers. Because he understands that the Union would not have been preserved without the aid of those 180,000 plus black men who served on the side of the Union. So if I were to give credit to any one group of people for Lincoln's evolving attitudes about race, it's those men who served for the Union.
Let's talk on that question first. Other commentary?
I would say almost the exact same thing, but I would add another tiny component. And that is, Lincoln is at the War Office a lot, and he checks the telegraph wires the way that we check email. He's really kind of addicted to news from the front. And generals, officers, are consistently sending him these messages about an attack that was averted because of spy information, essentially, given to us by what the officers call intelligent contrabands. In other words, there are former slaves and former slaves, not just soldiers and not just the educated and elite, who are actively aiding the Union cause. And I think that's important for Lincoln, too. The idea that people, even in slavery, could make an active contribution to that cause that he revered, the Union, that I think really has an impact on him too. So I think black soldiers are indisputably vital to his changing thinking. But I think not just soldiers. I think that the war really forces him to see a group of people he has not considered as central to the survival of the Union as actively contributing to the survival of the Union. And it's those active contributions, I think, that also push his thinking in ways that he couldn't have imagined before the war.
Well, this makes a great deal of sense to me because my reading of this, I ran across pretty much the same statement by Fauna, who says, in effect, that Lincoln's view of race changed and that it constituted a growth in him because he met with all of these people at the White House, and he runs through a string of people that I find myself wondering, well, how was that possible? That's really very simple for him simply to meet with Douglass and some of the others and change his mind about race. So this makes far more sense to me.
Well, see, as I view it, it is that, but it's also Lincoln as a person who can see within black people, who can make decisions, who actively do things, who are participants in their own freedom, and he comes to see them as more than he has seen them before. And I think the embodiment of that is Douglass. It has to be. But Douglass is that for many people. Douglass goes to England. And part of his myth, part of it's true. And as he's there, he sees a white man in a ditch, and he starts talking with the white man. Why are you there? And the man is drunk. And the myth is that he's Irish, and so he's drinking because poverty and everything. So, and the white man, a white man there says, "Why are you talking to him?" And so Douglass explains to him very much like King explained to Hoover, that I can think and talk more about than black people. And so he expands his horizons. He's showing that he's a man of the world. And I think Lincoln is also seeing Douglass very much, Lincoln's also seeing Douglass very much as that. Is a black man, but also a man of the world, who brings to him a certain idea. And so when he argues about these soldiers fighting, it is not just that they're fighting as soldiers. It is that they're fighting for their own freedom as active participants in the war. So they're not just chattel, they're not just bodies there, but they are people who can actually help him win. And when he makes that step, then they truly become men. They truly become human beings.
Now on to the second question about the persistence of beliefs about the origin of the Civil War as being primarily in states' rights, and the sense that a particular vision of the Old South and the Confederacy is still active in the present-day imaginary of some Americans.
Well, let me just say a brief word about that, because one of the books of mine will be coming out pretty soon. It has to do with slavery in the 20th century. And when I was working on it, I went over to Fredericksburg. I was checking into a hotel, and the lady asked me, she said, "Have you come for the reenactment?" I said, "The what?" "The reenactment." I said, "No, I haven't come for the reenactment. I didn't even know what was going on." But then I sat in the lobby and I watched all these people coming in and showing up for the reenactment. Some had costumes in their hands, and it was clear that something was happening, something was exciting. And so I talked to a couple of the people there because I was involved in this book. And I had discovered this tremendous array network of Sons of the South organizations throughout the South. And they were telling me something that was very important, that the legacy that we talk about has to do with slavery, but that the way in which they justify what they were doing was the preservation of what they call Southern culture. Now, it was not just a culture, it was Southern civilization to them. And so part of what they are acting out, and I don't know, they're not talking about slavery very much, but it is this sense of Southern civilization. And I'm not sure that I have read too many authors who actually have caught on to this, because American history is written within this prism of the Northern Eye, really. And when it's written within the Northern Eye, slavery has a place in it. But some of the Southern historians were trying to justify slavery by looking at it in terms of a wider view of the South. I think that has some merit. I really do. I don't think it should stand as a justification, but I think a more cultural view of the South and its difference. Because I think at the end of the day, I don't think you can explain the fundamental depth of the difference between the South and the North. And as I was talking about it, the ideology that developed and so forth, and that continues simply in terms of slavery. It has to do with the clash of civilizations right here in this country that we really have not, I think, really defined.
But is the civilization, at least in the South, not based on slavery?
No, it is. It is.
Bottom.
It is. It is. I said
Okay.
that's certainly a part of it, but it is wider than that, I think. And I'm not a historian enough to know all of the dimensions of it, but certainly I privileged some of what they were saying in terms of their attempt to try to act out and preserve a way of life that included slavery.
Right, right.
The question is, in this wider view of Southern civilization, what was the role of slavery? I think that's probably the academic
But
question.
then most whites didn't own slaves.
No, they didn't.
Oh, but they aspired to be
But
slave
they,
owners.
They aspired
Yeah,
to be.
yeah.
And this becomes a bigger question because the notion of whites then and now that somehow a movement or an advance for blacks is somehow hurting them or their forward movement. And I think probably you can give no better example than Lyndon Johnson in 64 at Howard. You know, you can't expect a man with a mule to catch up with the man with the caterpillar. And so he could say it. A caterpillar meaning a tractor, not a, bug. So, but he had a way of explaining it that by helping the people, you are not necessarily taking something from yourself. I think, in a way, this is something that Obama hit upon, because he was able to, Julian Bond tells this story, and I'm getting old, but I have never used the N-word in my life. And it has nothing to do with any political philosophy. It's just that I grew up in the South, and my grandmother used it quite often because she didn't, and it was just the way she grew up. And she was the closest person to God that I've ever seen. But she just, so Julian Barnes tells a story about going to this person's house asking for a vote, and maybe he's telling the story of someone else, and so he goes, and the woman, a white woman, says, he starts talking to her, and the white woman says, well, give me a minute. And Bubba's back there, her husband Bubba's back there, and she said, let me ask my husband, Bubba, who we voting for? And Bubba says, we voting for the end. Now, you know what Bubba meant, and you know why Bubba was doing it. Bubba was doing it because it was in his interest. He felt it was in his economic interest. And so as we look at the South, one problem is that people, I believe, get their particular interest confused with this notion of somehow some legacy, when in fact, and then there are examples, and here's what history comes in. If you ask a person what has been done in society that has aided a black person that has not aided whites almost as much, anything, you could say affirmative action. Well, then I can say, the glass ceiling. I can say Title IX. I can say, if I'm talking to a white person, I can say, ask your mother, because you can look. Or you can talk about public schools or public hospitals, all those things, the Reconstruction brought that set a legacy for white society to have. And that is what Roosevelt was able to do with the New Deal and things like that. It aided, and of course some people now saying that it didn't aid black people as much. There's debates now about whether the GI Bill, because of discrimination, all those things come in. But everything that's aided blacks in any way that people that you were speaking about has probably done as much or done more for whites in general, including the right to vote, where all whites in the South did not vote, could not vote. Property, man, property.
Well, those were two very rich questions, and I see that we have a lineup, so we're going to have to be crisper. Just as a footnote, there is the Tredegar Museum, which is in Richmond, and that presents a very interesting view of the Civil War. They say that they have the only unified view of the Civil War, in which they have a Southern, Northern, and African American view. Their interpretation suggests that Southerners fought for home and family, Northerners fought for union, and African Americans fought for freedom, excuse me. Now, of course, as historians, we can say this is to some degree simplistic, since some people in the North undoubtedly fought for home and family also, and some African Americans fought for home and family, not just freedom. But as a way of thinking about the Civil War, it's a very, very interesting and very rich presentation, and they allow many different points of view to live in that story, and it's a very interesting way to talk about it. They also let people vote. When you come in, you can see a movie and you can vote on what you think are the most important reasons for the Civil War. And then they tell you how your group voted and how all the people who've come to the museum have since voted. And it's quite interesting. Our next questioner, who's been very patient.
Oh, that's all right. I forgot about the historical changes that have occurred in the meantime. I was particularly interested in the comparison of political and ideological compromise from the Lincoln period to the present made by Professors Medford and Walters. But I wanted to ask a question about compromise in that time period for Lincoln. And in particular, just to explain my focus, I was moved, as I never am, to defend President Bush when there was an article in the paper a couple of years ago, a year or two ago, considering whether he was the worst, among the worst presidents. And I wrote a letter to the Post saying that there's no possibility that anybody could beat out Andrew Johnson. And he was the biggest racist, and that I would have protest any other suggestion. And so that gets to Lincoln. And we know that presidents pick, especially considering Johnson as a Democrat in Tennessee, pick their vice presidents for political pressure reasons and for compromise and to moderate. But how did he stand Johnson? I mean, or did he, even if he was making the progress near the end of his presidency and then he picks Johnson, did they speak to each other? No. How did you deal with the racism of your, not just to mention your cabinet, but of people around you? And you know, and couldn't his last words have been "shoot Johnson" before I go?
The short answer is no. He never interacted with Johnson. I'm exaggerating, but no, there's almost no interaction between them. It was the choice of Johnson. He was uninvolved in, which is unusual because Lincoln is a political animal. But he really played very little role in the choice of Johnson as running mate. As far as I can tell, gave Johnson minimal thought at best and almost never interacted with him, which is not a very satisfying answer to your question. I have no idea what he really thought about him, but they're not having tea together on a daily basis. So.
And isn't Johnson selected because that part of Tennessee that he comes from was so useful to the Union?
Yeah, absolutely.
And so it's really sort of payment.
Yes,
for what
absolutely.
had been accomplished by people in Tennessee, in that part of Tennessee, up until that point. But yes, he probably should have said, "Shoot Johnson," you know.
Because he didn't know he was going to be assassinated.
Yeah,
so.
and he didn't speak again. But someone should have thought to shoot Johnson. Really should have. But Buchanan though was equally as bad.
The same thing.
So it's not.
This gentleman's been waiting. Thank you.
I appreciated Professor Walker's quotation from the Cooper Union address. A week from this Saturday will be the 150th anniversary of the Cooper Union address. And those of us who belong to the Lincoln Group of D.C. are having an open discussion at the New York Avenue Presbyterian Church on Saturday morning from 10 to 12 of the Cooper Union address. It's free, everyone's invited, and we want to talk about a lot of these issues. But particularly, there's one quote from the Cooper Union address that I'd like the panel to comment on. Lincoln thought a lot about the Constitution. And he said, when the Constitution refers to a slave, he's referred to as a person. And that the Constitution was deliberately written so that it excluded the idea that there could be property in man. This is before the war. This is a candidate for president. What are your thoughts about Lincoln's view that the framers of the Constitution really had in mind fundamental principles that excluded the idea that you could have property in man?
But what he also says, if I'm recalling correctly, I believe it was at Cooper Union, he talks about the fact that they don't ever use, that the framers of the Constitution don't ever use the term slave because they were embarrassed at the idea that slavery was a part of this new nation. And so they put it on to the path of extinction by not including it, that they couldn't cut it out wholesale. Like, you know, if you have a cancer, you know, if you try to cut the cancer out, you might kill the person. And so if you attempted to remove slavery, as a whole, then the same thing might occur with the nation. You kill the nation, or you don't allow these various entities to come together. But Lincoln, even though he acknowledged, that the Constitution saw black people as persons, he still also believed that there were certain constitutional rights in property. And so he believed that Congress had no ability to attack slavery except in those areas where Congress had control, which would have been in the territories and in the District of Columbia. So while he may have acknowledged that they were not, that the Constitution doesn't really view them as property, he also says, though, that property is protected by the Constitution, and the nation saw enslaved people as property, and he certainly was not willing to change that. In fact, he uses that as an excuse, as reason for not moving forward with slavery. I wouldn't use the term excuse, but reason for not moving forward.
But the concept of property comes from John Locke, comes from the Constitution of South Carolina, which was embodied in the ideas. They knew exactly what they were. Slaves were property. Slaves were not considered as man. It wouldn't matter what Lincoln said. It wouldn't matter what his interpretation was. The fact was that most of the founders saw that, and they took it from Lockean philosophy, which was that man can do whatever they want to with their property. If slaves be property, then they are not men. Now, philosophically, and going back to the beginnings,
my take is a tiny bit different. To the part of your question, is Lincoln reading the founders right? I think that we all really, really want the founders on our side. And so we assume that there is a position that all the founders take. What I think is the founders profoundly disagreed amongst themselves on that very question. And so that the real legacy of the founders is dissent and disagreement on that question. I think Lincoln is right in the bulk of that address when he says, but if you add up what most of them said later, we see a clear desire for at least limiting the extension. I think he's right about that there's a clear majority in favor of, at the very least, not extending. But I don't think there's an idea that they all agree on anywhere in the Constitution, and it's certainly not on that one. We'd love it if he's right, but I think that he might be looking for unanimity that doesn't really exist in 1787.
But isn't he recognizing as well that there is a contradiction?
Yes.
And he certainly sees it in the Declaration of Independence as well, but he still loves both documents, and he uses both documents to justify his action or inaction in many instances. Yeah.
I'm not too sure, Maurice, that I agree with you. Okay, on Locke, because Locke's view of this question of property and slavery was from Plato. The ancient view was that you could be property and a person. As a matter of fact, in ancient civilization, slaves had rights, and they were considered to be a part of the civil community. The uniqueness of Western slavery was that it colluded that, which is to say that it did strike at the humanity of the person who was property and subordinated his whole existence.
Because Locke had stock in the Royal African Company, and by doing that, he had to justify his ownership of stock, and so therefore he developed his theory, in my belief. Of course, you remember Locke's theory comes in the 16th century and 17th century, and the ideas of slavery developed after he's dead. So, but I agree that it does come from Plato's understanding.
Right, but I think we must privilege the impact of Western slavery, which is to say that it did strike at the heart of the humanity of the person and reduce that person to chattel.
And it played a different economic role in the growth of a nation than, say, slavery played in ancient Greece.
Absolutely.
Yes, sir.
My name is Guy Lopez, and I'm an enrolled member of the Crow Creek Sioux tribe, or nation. And, we all see race and, Lincoln and the presidency with our own particular perspectives, and I have to see it from the perspective of my ancestry, my heritage, which the Crow Creek Sioux Reservation began as a concentration camp. And, that's a lot to say, but during Lincoln's presidency, there was an uprising in Minnesota. It's called the Great Sioux Uprising, and it led to a small war, which then led to the largest mass hanging in U.S. history. 38 of my ancestors were hung at the same time. And I think it was in Mankato, Minnesota. And, so I'm looking at race and Lincoln and the American presidency, and I'm saying, where is this, analysis that goes beyond sort of the black-white dichotomy? Or say, this kind of political give and take and, this battle that we've had going on, maybe it comes out of the heritage, slavery and the Civil War, and, but it's still being played today in Washington, D.C. We don't have an analysis of race, a good enough analysis of race that really can explain, other racial considerations and questions. And so that's the challenge I have for all of you. And I think we share, American Indians share a common struggle with African Americans in terms of the states' rights issues, because we're still battling the states. We're still looking for the federal government to intervene on our behalf in defense of our rights against state incursions. And we're still at the front lines fighting this battle. And I wonder how African Americans can help us here in Washington, D.C.
In the present.
Yeah, in the present and in the future.
And in the future.
Well, some of what you say, well, what you're touching on really is my problem with the minoritization of our ethnicity in this country, because our histories are so different and people try to collude them into one category, and they don't fit in that category. You have a very powerful and unique and different history, which is one of the answers to this. And the state has handled it differently. Just look at the last month. The Obama administration has come out in support of $1 billion of reparations to the Indian tribes. There's nothing like that on the map for African Americans, which is one of the reasons why there is this feeling that if you look at the Department of Interior, you have an agency there, and so forth. And so the popular feeling is so much of the Native American thing has been handled. We know it hasn't, all right? We know it hasn't, that there's still struggles. But that is certainly very different from the ongoing struggle of African Americans. My latest book, The Price of Racial Reconciliation, was written to make that point, because we're in a national discussion about reparations. And you have to answer the question at the end of the day, why does this persist? Well, part of the reason for that is that we see around us, that is to say African Americans, the way in which other groups have received respect for their own unique history, retribution for things, even reparations. And so this story persists largely because of the fact that there is this tremendous, unrequited debt on this country. So that's part of the emotional reason for this. And that's one of the reasons why this whole discussion came out, and then it'll die down, it'll come back again. I'm not sure that African Americans have the power to assist you. I am sure that that history belongs somewhere in our discussion because of the extent to which many of us have the same heritage. I mean, I'm from Kansas. My family in southeastern Kansas is part Cherokee. And you can repeat that in the black community ad infinitum. So that there's something there. But let me also hasten to say that it wasn't very nice when the Cherokees threw out off of the A roll either. So that there are some tensions there that really have to be dealt with. And the politics of that, I think, have to be settled. But one of my best friends in the world, Dr. Willard Johnson, emeritus professor at MIT, is an expert on African Americans and the Cherokee and all of those roles and all of that history, and is working hard to put together an African American segment on the Trail of Tears, commemoration by the National Park Service. So there is some attempt to put these histories together, but it is difficult because, quite frankly, of a lot of the blowback on the part of the Native American side with respect to African Americans when we attempt to sort of develop this common history.
Other commentary? Well,
I have a question.
Okay.
I have these questions here, and one intrigues me. And that's number
wait.
to this. Okay.
Yes. Just to make one comment that has to do with the issue of sovereignty, which is a very key issue that I know in Native American communities. And I think that there are some very profound differences between seeking sovereignty that has been, let's say, specified in various treaties, whether they were actually acted on or whether they were abrogated, but sovereignty has been specified at various times in various treaties with various First Nations people, and that sovereignty has been abrogated numerous times. And that, I think, refers to part of the struggle that you're talking about in terms of will the federal government intervene on behalf of Indian sovereignty as against the claims of particular states. And, as you know perhaps better than I, there is a whole constitutional history about this that is quite complicated. I think that there is a fundamental difference between the story or the larger history of African Americans who have often sought to be included within the sovereign body of the nation as citizens, and the struggle for Native peoples to have their own independent sovereignty recognized. There are some key differences in the flow, the historical flow of those experiences. However, under segregation, under the structure of a racial hierarchy in which America became a formally segregated society, the experiences of a number of people, African American, Native American, Asian American, Latino, many of these experiences became in some ways more similar due to the discrimination that was erected as part of that system of racial hierarchy. Just as a footnote, there is actually a very interesting exhibition over at the National Museum of the American Indian right now, and on African Americans and Native Americans and the history of inclusion, exclusion, intermarriage, conflict. It's not a simple story. It's a complex story. And that's a very interesting exhibition I would encourage people to visit. And there's a book, Indivisible, that comes out of that I think shows a number of scholars and a number of activists who are struggling to talk about, how these stories converge and how they diverge, and what are the areas of commonality and what are the areas of difference. I think you bring up a very interesting question. Thank you.
But complex. And one of the ways that I've developed my attitude on that, I was a senior consultant to the Kellogg Foundation and actually went out to some of the tribal areas and sat down and talked about sovereignty issues. We were worried about welfare reform and the social safety net and how that interfaced with what the states were trying to do and the complexity of that whole political discussion. That taught me a lot about the differences in our histories. So it was an on-the-ground thing, not a book thing. The question of segregation I just want to make a brief comment about that because that's one of my peaks. The fact that you have these groups who have, in some ways, been segregated, really, in many ways, historically, is the least of the forms of oppression that they're suffering.
Yeah, that I could agree with you about
okay.
that. But I do think
look,
that system...
I'm not talking to you now.
Yes.
Well, I'm talking to our historians, okay?
Yes.
Because what they have done, if you read the books, and they stop at segregation. Mm. Many of our own books have stopped at segregation. Mm-hmm. But beyond that, the wider picture of the nature of the oppression faced by African Americans in this country has not yet been described. So that's why I think that this becomes an easy shill to say that African Americans and Asians and so forth were discriminated against. But Asians have faced, really, again, and Native Americans, very horrible histories in this country.
Absolutely.
And yet they have not actually been described. So I think we ought to climb down from the Harvard historians and those people who pass out tenure and really sort of manage the way in which our history is written. And to say that, yes, segregation was a part of it. But if we are going to describe what actually has happened to these groups, we have to have the whole history, the whole story. And it is far different than that.
Oh, it's much more complex. And there's actually a couple generations now of scholars who've been bringing this history to the fore.
This is what drove Zen to write this book from the ground up, history from the ground up, because when you write it that way, then you take it out of the hands of the elite historians who have sort of given us a picture of Americans as kind of light, on the light side of things.
Sir.
Yes. Good evening. Very enlightening discussion this evening. I do believe that Lincoln looked at the Declaration of Independence as being something universal, that it was a statement about the human condition and how we could advance the human condition if we all had life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. He took it almost as a crusade. The Declaration of Independence, as I understand it historically, is kind of an incomplete document. It is not a real good universal statement in and of itself. It was a list of grievances to mark a part of history, trying to say why it was right to move from one government to another government. Everybody takes a look at that document kind of in various different ways. Lincoln was seeking universal truths out of it. I think a lot of people in various parts of the country looked at it at different perspectives. Perhaps in the South, they saw it as an opportunity to express limited government, something that they had to escape from England in the 16th century. So I'm wondering if you can see that as a whole, that we are here on a 400-year sort of experiment that sort of just happened and is continuing to evolve. And we see it all from our various different perspectives, and it's still evolving. It was never, it's not, the Declaration and the Constitution aren't biblical. They don't hold biblical universal truths. What they do is show a point of time, and then we see ourselves in relations to what was said in those documents.
All right.
Well, I think it's important to remember that Lincoln grew up in a 19th century United States that did see the Declaration as more than just a list of grievances. There was he grew up in an era that was having a pretty active conversation about what that Declaration meant. He was 17 years old, I think, in 1826, the 50th anniversary of the Declaration, which happened 6 years after the Missouri Compromise. The Missouri Compromise sparks a discussion about what is this document all about, and that's an interesting discussion to take a look at. By 1861, you have white Southerners who are talking about the Declaration in the way you're talking about, that really it's a treatise for limited government. That's not what white Southerners are saying, it's not what anyone's saying in 1826. In 1826, 1820 to 1826, the conversation is about, when it says all men, does it really mean all men, or does it mean all white men? And that's but in other words, it's even as, at the time the document is written, for most people the list of grievances is the important part. We're about to overthrow a government, we better have some pretty good reasons. By the 50th anniversary, however, that's not the most important part. The most important part is the preamble, is the idea that there had to be more than just particular reasons. There had to be something universal to justify this experiment. And the big debate in the 1820s is who counts in universal. By the 1860s, there is the reading that you're talking about as a treatise for a limited government. So you're right in the sense that how people read the Declaration changes over time, but I think it's a little dangerous to say that it's only us that looks back and sees it as a statement of universals, because Lincoln grew up in a culture that was inclined to see it that way. That isn't just us looking back. That's a culture in which he grew up.
Well, I agree with that. I think that he did see it as universal, and that probably the predominant culture did. When I'm saying that it's a document of a certain period of time that expresses certain sentiments, and we form opinions related to those statements in that document and in the Constitution as well.
It is actually rather interesting to note that the language that flows from the Declaration of Independence has been used in, I think the Constitution Center estimates something like over 200 constitutions and declarations around the world in various nations. So it's rather interesting that of course, as once the revolution is achieved in the United States, now that we're in the 21st century, the list of grievances, of course, is far less important than these words, which to many people around the world seem to carry a universal message. But by comparison, there are not as many countries around the world that have used the model of our Constitution, the way the government is organized. That has not been as influential as the words from the Declaration of Independence. So it's rather interesting to think about how these words have ramified around the world, and which elements of our two documents are more influential and which are less influential on other people around the world. We want to make sure that there is time for everyone to look at the books that are in the back. Are there any closing comments that you would like to make at this point?
Just that 19th century men are able to look at the words of the Declaration of Independence. They profess some kind of belief in the equality of all men, but they're more than ready to deny that same equality to large segments of people in the population, and not just African Americans, but women as well.
Right.
And for a very long time, at least in the first part of the 19th century, even people who have religious differences or people who don't meet property qualifications and those kinds of things. So they have convinced themselves that they are people who believe in equality, but they really don't show it in action.
And actually, as the gentleman raised, Native Americans are not in the internal parts of that discussion
Absolutely.
At all in the early 19th
Indeed.
century, as you pointed. Well, this has been really very stimulating. I want to thank you all so much for coming, and it's been a very exciting evening. And please go back to the back of the room and check out the various publications of our panel. Thank you.